Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. As Diana said, I've been a fellow at Caspis, just off campus here at Stanford, for the last 9 months. I've got just a couple weeks left before I head back to Ohio, so I'm going to miss the sunshine here quite a bit. It's been a great year. I've just loved being here. It's been one of my favorite professional years of my life. I'm excited to talk to you about the research I've been doing roughly the last decade or so, looking at the relationship between schools and inequality and trying to really understand how schools matter. And this issue, the problem that I identify is that the US is rhetorically committed to providing children with more equal opportunity, doing something to equalize opportunity in the world, but really has fallen short in meeting that aspirational goal. And so the question that I'm going to talk about today and consider is the following. What role do schools play in limiting opportunity for the disadvantaged? And I'm going to make the case that it's a different role perhaps than most of us have thought. And really my talk is largely going to be about a personal journey of my views shifting over time, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why they've shifted. But the talk is going to proceed in kind of 3 parts. First of all, I'm going to discuss a few of the sort of broad ideas that exist with big brushstrokes, sort of what is the relationship between schools and inequality in the stratification system. Then I'm going to talk about what empirical evidence has prompted me to change my ideas over time. And then finally, I'm going to talk for a little bit about, well, if I'm right about the relationship now, and if my views have shifted toward a more accurate understanding, then what should change? What kinds of things should change about our theories, our research, and our policy making in terms of trying to improve opportunities for the disadvantaged? So let's start with some of the ideas. This is a popular quote from Horace Mann, who, basically argued that schools are the great equalizer. According to the European theory, men are divided into classes, some to toil and earn, others to seize and enjoy. But according to the Massachusetts theory, all are to have an equal chance for earning and equal security in the enjoyment of what they earn. Education, then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is a great equalizer of the conditions of men. So this really represents what I'm going to put on a continuum. This aspirational idea of Horace Mann's really represents the far end of viewing schools as a great equalizer, as a compensatory force within society. Now this view, has still some support among the general public, but we've always worried that this isn't really how things are operating, that schools are really advantaging the already advantaged more than providing an equal opportunity for everyone. And so in the 1960s, the government was especially concerned about this problem and commissioned James Coleman to analyze this issue. And he did his massive Coleman report of over 650,000 students in American society. And everyone expected that Coleman would find, clear and convincing evidence that schools' distribution of unequal resources and unequal quality would play a major role explaining differences in student outcomes. But they were surprised that that's not what Coleman found. And Coleman famously concluded that one implication stands out above all, that schools bring little influence to bear on a child's achievement that is independent of his background and general social context. He really concluded that the schools were playing a pretty modest role in all of this. And so I'd place Coleman sort of here in this neutral area, along with Jenks, who replicated Coleman's work. And this was a very different view of schools, one that a lot of social scientists disagreed with and felt like Coleman, by finding this sort of neutral effect of schools, is really not uncovering the pernicious ways that schools really exacerbate inequality. And so in response to the Coleman report, we have really spent the last half century, a lot of energy has gone into the social sciences describing ways that Coleman was probably wrong and that schools really do exacerbate inequality. As one example, here's a quote from Bowles and Guinness. "The system, as it stands today, provides eloquent testament to the ability of the well-to-do to perpetuate in the name of equal opportunity an arrangement which consistently yields to themselves disproportionate advantages, while thwarting the aspirations and needs of the working people of the US." So I would put, there, in response to Coleman, this big group of scholars emerged that said Coleman is wrong. Schools are not neutral. In fact, they make inequality worse because of a wide range of reasons. Just a couple of them here. Bowles and Guinness argued that, look, the school system's subservient to the capitalist economy. And what schools do is some schools, they serve advantaged kids and they prepare them to be managers and leaders in this economy. They teach them certain skills that fit with those roles. Other schools, they teach disadvantaged kids and they prepare them to be the workers in this capitalist economy. Other scholars took different approaches. Bourdieu made the case that, look, teachers and administrators, they can identify kids through their, they can identify kids through their speech, their habits, their style, their dress. They can identify whether those kids are from elite backgrounds. And when they do, when they identify a kid from an elite background, they reward that kid above and beyond how they really should be rewarded in the system via this identification of their cultural capital. And others like Causal have outlined how differences in school funding, because our school funding is typically relies on local funding in the US, that these differences result in vastly different degrees of resources in schools, and that exacerbates inequality. So my own perspective on this, I started here in the exacerbate column because I went to graduate school, I read all of these theorists, and this view resonated with me. It jibed with my own personal experience, having been inside some of these schools that serve disadvantaged kids. And it jibed with sort of, I don't know, the Hollywood movies I had seen, you know, that tend to portray the schools serving disadvantaged kids as really problematic. And often you've got the incredible teacher comes in and might fix it for a little bit, but generally the underlying premise is that these schools serving disadvantaged kids are really very poor. However, I was just minding my own business in 1992 when my advisor asked me to read an article. It was Summer Setback by Entwistle and Alexander. And it's not that often that you read an article and it changes how you think the world works. But this article did change how I thought about schools and inequality. And I didn't change my ideas immediately. I read the article and I thought, there's something wrong with this article. You know, it's just a study of Baltimore. There's something weird about it. And I'm going to tell you the details of their kind of study a little bit later. But I really resisted their ideas at first. And I didn't really want to change my ideas because I'd created this part of my introductory sociology course where we talked about schools, and it had 2 days, and I loved this section of the course because on the first day we talked about between school differences and how they make inequality worse, and the second day we talked about within school differences and how they make inequality worse, and the students loved it. I had them read Causal, they really liked it, and it just worked, and I didn't really want to change it. But that was the beginning of my shift, that reading that article and not really being able to understand why is it that what happened in Baltimore is that inequalities in kids' reading and math skills, they grew faster in the summer than during the school year. Just didn't make any sense if schools are an institution that makes inequality worse. I'll talk a little bit more about that seasonal comparison research in a minute, but that was the beginning, not so much of an epiphany, but more of a gradual, I think it was more like Kubler-Ross's stages of grieving, where you go through denial, anger, and all those things. And it took me quite a while, though, to get to the point where I shifted, and I'm going to explain to you guys why I've shifted so dramatically over to viewing schools much more like Mann described and playing a much more positive role than I previously thought. So I'm not the first to make this argument that we don't give schools enough credit and that we are sort of blaming schools in ways that are unfair. The Coleman report started to make that argument. Jenks, his Replication and Inequality made a similar argument. The Manufactured Crisis, Tinkering Toward Utopia, Class in School, Someone Has to Fail. All of these books have made a similar, at some level, have overlapped with the argument that I'm going to make today. What's unique about my position and how I'm going to present this today is I'm going to rely on some empirical evidence that I think is stronger than the evidence that all of these authors employed. So first of all, I want to tell you about an article I read. I was reading this in my article in my office. It was an article by Herbert Wahlberg, and he made this outlandish statement. He said that the average 18-year-old American has spent just 13% of their waking hours in school. I remember reading that and saying out loud, that's wrong. That's too low. I've got kids. I'm taking them to school all the time. I'm picking them up. There's no way it's just 13%. So I got out a piece of paper, a pencil, calculator, and I started cranking out my son Nicholas's schedule. He was about 10 at the time when I was doing this. And I said, okay, the kid sleeps about 10 hours a night, took all that out of the denominator, looked at just the time awake, and I estimated, once the dust cleared, I estimated that my son Nicholas would have spent 15% of his waking hours in school by the time he's 18. It was, slightly higher than Wahlberg's estimate of 13%, and I think it's because I didn't let Nick miss a single day of school. He had to go every day, couldn't drop out at all. But whether it's 13 or 15% isn't the point. The main point is the vast majority of time that children spend awake is not in school. Schools, it's a non-trivial institution. However, the vast majority of time that children are awake, they're not in school. So you have this gigantic 800-pound gorilla of the non-school environment that really shapes children's lives. And if you really want to understand how schools matter, if you're serious about understanding how they really matter, you can't ignore that 87% of children's lives. In part because it's just so big, but also because children don't go home to similar home environments. Some of them go home to these really stable families where the parents have all these educational resources and they have these verbal interactions with the kid, and they give them carrots and hummus snacks, and they read them Goodnight Moon, and these are just really developmentally terrific home environments. But other kids don't have that, and they go home to very different home environments, and home environments that are very stressful, where their health needs may not be consistently met. They may be hungry. Their parents may be physically abusive. It's an unstable, stressful environment that varies dramatically across home environments. So the fact that that kids spend most of their time in these non-school environments, and these non-school environments vary dramatically, really means that if we are serious about trying to understand how schools matter, we have to take that problem very seriously. My big question is about the role of schools in inequality, and there's a lot of different ways I could talk about that. I'm interested in sort of the big picture of how this matters. I could look at inequality across like socioeconomic status, or racial ethnic groups, or gender, a broad range of social groups, and I could look at a lot of different outcomes. I could look at cognitive skills like reading and math skills, educational attainment, health, social and behavioral skills. All of those things are of interest to me. The empirical evidence I'm going to show you in the next 15, 20 minutes here is mostly, though, on the relationship between socioeconomic status and cognitive skills, not so much because I'm not interested in the other parts, but because the methodological approach that I'm going to talk about has primarily to date been applied to cognitive gaps, or math and reading skill gaps across SES. Now we're starting to expand that to other areas, and I think that's one thing that needs to be done in this area, but most of the work so far has been done in this area, so I'm going to mostly talk about that. So here's a pattern that if you guys forget everything else I say today, remember this pattern. So this is, on the y-axis, are children's mean cognitive score. And this is in standard deviation units. So you've got 0 here, so anything above that is above average. Anything below it is below average. And the blue line here represents children whose mother has a college education. And you can see that they're consistently scoring high on these cognitive skills, what we would expect. The yellow line at the bottom are children whose mother has less than a high school education. And no surprise, those children are scoring much lower on this. And on the x-axis is the children's age in years. Now, if you go out to age 18, you see what we would all expect, this large achievement gap. This is one of the challenges and problems that we're all concerned with how big this is. It's 1.4 standard deviations at this point. But here's what I want you to note about this particular graph, is follow that gap backward in time to age 3, and you see that it's already, at age 3, it was already 1.25 standard deviations. It's about 90% of it is already in place by age 3 before formal schooling has a chance to matter. This is in the United States of America. This is a pattern from Brooks, Gunn, and Heckman's research. And when I first saw this, I had a similar, wait a second, are you kidding me, kind of response that I had to Wahlberg's 13% estimate. So I viewed this as so important that I got the data that I look at myself. I tend to study the early childhood longitudinal study data. I took it. I didn't even want my grad students to do this. I wanted to do it myself. I coded it and all this. And said, do I find these same patterns? And I did. And then I looked at one of Sean Reardon's studies where Sean takes 10 different data sets and analyzes all of them, kind of thing. And he is finding the same kinds of patterns of these gaps are stable. They're not increasing very much during the school years. Now, I think that single empirical pattern, I could sit down and not tell you the rest of the story right now. That single empirical pattern should make you think very seriously about the view that schools exacerbate inequality. I think it's an extremely difficult, I guess you could somehow come up with a narrative that schools are the bad guys with this pattern, but it stretches you, doesn't it? It makes it very difficult. I think there should be a constitutional amendment that requires all education scholars to publish this at the beginning of every article. That this is what you should have to acknowledge, that this pattern exists, and then you can talk about whatever else it is that you want to talk about. But this is absolutely critical. I really think sometimes we lose sight of which empirical patterns are important and which are not. This is a really important empirical pattern, and it's very difficult to understand how schools can play a major role shaping SES gaps in cognitive skills, given that most of those gaps are already in place well before children arrive at those schools. So I'm going to talk about some other empirical patterns, but keep it in perspective. That's the big one. That is huge compared to everything else I'm going to talk about. But there are 2 or 3 other empirical patterns that have also shaped my perspective. Before I jump into those, though, I want to just get one thing straight about how we understand treatment effects. So let's suppose we had a drug, and we want to know whether this drug promotes cognitive functioning. And we observe a bunch of subjects on this drug during the treatment period, and nothing happens. They don't improve at all. No change. Now, the surface interpretation of this would be the drug has no effect whatsoever. But what if I revealed to you that before these patients were taking the drug, they were on this trajectory during the non-treatment period? Now you would probably have a different conclusion. Maybe these were elderly people whose cognitive functioning was declining. We give them this drug, and all of a sudden it stops that decline. And you can imagine that had we not given them the drug, that they would have continued to decline at the rate that they had been declining. So the moral of the story here is, to understand the treatment effect, you don't just look at the treatment period. You have to look at the treatment period compared to the non-treatment period, and then you get a sense for whether this treatment is actually working or not. This doesn't sound like schools, it sounds like drugs, but believe me, I'll come back to this in a minute. You can similarly imagine, what if we had a group of subjects who were on a kind of an incline in terms of cognitive skills, children who are learning a lot and improving their skills, and if we just observed again during this treatment period, this flat line, we would misdiagnose how the treatment really matters. So the critical thing we need to do to understand whether a treatment works or not is compare the treatment period to the non-treatment period. Okay, and part of the reason that's important is if we think about what we know about SES skills, SES gaps in cognitive skills, we know that they're on this trajectory from an early age. There's a very small difference in high and low SES kids' cognitive skills when they're measured at the very first times that we can basically reliably measure their cognitive skills.
Can you say something about the magnitude?
The magnitude when...
At the earliest point of measurement?
At the earliest point, it is statistically significant, but it's more like a month of cognitive skill development. Whereas when you get to kindergarten, it's more like 3 or 4 months. And that magnitude, what I would posit is that if schools are neutral and play no role whatsoever in shaping inequality, what we should see then is we should see these gaps continue on that same trajectory. Given that they were on a trajectory of growth, they should continue to grow, and yet this is not what we see. We don't see this continued growth in inequality. So just the fact that during the school years, these inequalities don't seem to grow suggests that, gives us a hint that schools may be playing a compensatory role in this process. Here's another reason why I think there's reason to believe that schools play a more positive role for disadvantaged children than we may have thought. This is work that I did that was inspired by that article I read in 1992 by Entwistle and Alexander. What they did is they compared how inequality changes during the summer versus the school year. And you can think of this as like a crossover design experiment in medical research where they observe patients off treatment, just like I showed you before. They'll observe patients off treatment for a while, and then they'll apply a treatment, and they'll see how much things change. How do the patient outcomes change when the treatment's applied? In this case, you can think of it as summer is when kids are off treatment. They're not exposed to schools. Let's see how things change once they go to school. And what was unique about this strategy or this analytic approach is that it circumvents the problem of trying to understand how schools matter by, Coleman tried to measure all the things about home and measure all the things about school and add them, combine them up and see like which one wins in a regression model. And we all know, it doesn't work well because you don't measure everything about home that matters. You don't measure very well everything about schools that matter. And that, what I would call a measurement-based approach to trying to understand how schools matter is doomed. Mostly because, kids some learn faster and slower than others for a lot of reasons that we don't understand and don't measure in those typical surveys. This approach circumvents that problem, and it provides more leverage for understanding how schools really matter in terms of inequality. So here's what we did. Entwistle and Alexander did this in Baltimore, and Hines did it in Atlanta. And so when nationally representative data became available in the early childhood longitudinal study of children beginning kindergarten in 1998, colleagues of mine and I, we looked at what happens to inequality when school is in versus out. And we found in the summer, what we found is kind of what the other scholars found, and that is that the gaps grow, that high SES kids, they learn some, low SES kids, some of them might, tread water, or they might actually lose some skills during the summer, what Entwistle and Alexander called summer setback. And I viewed this pattern as rather mundane. I didn't think the summer was all that interesting. This is exactly what I would predict before looking at the data. But what was fascinating were the school year patterns during kindergarten and first grade. When school was in session, both groups learned at about the same rate, which this pattern suggests to me that when school's not in session, when they're not exposed to the treatment, what's happening is inequality is growing, and schools are squishing that inequality down. There are some compensatory processes going on in schools that are resulting in less inequality than if the kids weren't in school. And this pattern is really, I think, has strong implications for how we understand the role of schools and inequality. And it really suggests that they may be playing a much more positive role than we typically think. The advantage to this perspective is that it can identify, really, it doesn't specifically identify them, but it compares all of the processes in schools that are making inequality worse with all of them that are reducing inequality, and the result is it looks like schools are compensatory. Now, this particular study that we did, one restriction to it was it's just looking at kids in a really early stages of schooling. The ECLSK has also come out with a second study that looked at children who started kindergarten in 2010. We have since replicated these patterns largely in that second set of data. And we've started to look at patterns in the Northwest Evaluation Association data that is this data set where the Northwest Evaluation Association is this nonprofit organization that basically goes to school districts and says, hey, we'll test kids for you and provide a report of how your kids are progressing. And they're one of the few organizations that test kids both at the beginning and end of the school year. So the real value to that is not only can you see how much they grow during the 9 months, but then people like me can see what's happening in the summer when they're not there. And what's happening when kids are not in school is the key leverage for understanding how schools matter. Comparing what happens when they're not versus when they are in school. So this x-axis, it's not showing up here for formatting reasons or whatever, but it's the months since they began kindergarten. And we've got observations of these kids twice a year all the way out to 11th grade. And what you see, these are reading scores, and basically this is the mean, the average reading score for kids. So you can see that they learn like crazy at first, and then they don't learn as much, and that levels off quite a bit. And if you look at the summers, which are here in blue, you can see little evidence of, that either like they don't learn as fast during the summers, or sometimes they actually lose a little bit of skill. And the overall gain in the mean, I don't know if you guys can read that, but the overall gain in the mean on this particular scale over between kindergarten and 11th grade, the kids on average gained 81 points on this scale. 85.7 of that came when school was in session, and they lost 4.4 points on average when school was out. So here you see similar kinds of patterns of gaining lots of skills when school is in, but losing some skills during the summer. Now, this particular data set, one thing that's kind of a bummer is they don't have a measure of kids' socioeconomic status. So I can't compare high SES and low SES kids with these data, which I would love to do. But here's what I can do, is I can show you how the variance in these kids' skills changes when school is in versus out. So we can estimate the standard deviation. This is the overall variance in skills, not a achievement gap between high and low SES kids, but the overall variance in the skills. And if I do that, now on the y-axis is the standard deviation, not the mean. And you can see the standard deviation starts out close to 14 here, and then it goes through some wiggles, and it generally goes up a little bit, kind of like you would expect kids to span out a little bit over time. But the question that I'm interested in is what happens during the summers versus the school years? How does the standard deviation or that variance change? And what we learn is that the overall, between kindergarten and the end of 11th grade, the variance increases by 4.14 points on this particular scale. Only 0.33 of that came during the school periods. The vast majority of it came during the smaller, shorter summer periods, 3.81, or, you know, the vast majority. 95% of it basically came from the summer periods. So this is at least, again, consistent with the notion that schools are reducing the amount of inequality that we would observe in their absence. Now, one question is, how do we understand these patterns given that schools vary so dramatically in quality that, you know, are parents crazy when they spend all that money to, you know, buy a home in a good school district or send their kid to a private school? Well, here are a couple of ways that I've been thinking about this. First of all, you know, I think schools, they do vary in quality. Some are better than others, and you have good schools and you have poor schools here. But non-school environments vary more. And you've got kids who enjoy good homes and some who enjoy poor homes that are not really conducive to the child's cognitive development or development in other ways either. And so what can happen is a kid from a poor home can go to a poor school and actually enjoy a bigger boost from that than a kid from a good home going to a good school. And so if this is right, it may not be so much that you know, the schools serving disadvantaged kids are great, but they're just not nearly as bad as what they experience in the home environment. So you can think of this one way, like in Ohio, funding differences between good and poor schools, the good schools might enjoy about 3 times more money per pupil expenditures than the poorly funded schools. But if we think about the differences in income and household income in the non-school environments in people's homes, the difference between rich people and poor people is not just 3 times. It's 30 million, 300 million. I mean, it's gigantic. It's in a whole different universe compared to the differences in school funding. So I think, you know, there are some people starting to do empirical studies to see if this view of the world holds up, and I think there's reason to believe that it will. So this is one way to kind of think about how schools might be compensatory, how schools could be unequal but still be an equalizing force. I think another way that's helpful to think about this issue is to think about, you know, we tend to develop a lot of different ideas about ways that schools make inequality worse. And I've just listed some of them here, like class size, funding, curriculum. And so if the rich kids enjoy smaller classrooms than the poor kids, then they might enjoy a better school outcome as a result. And what we see, you know, we see the rich kids have higher reading and math test scores, and they often enjoy smaller classrooms. So it seems to make sense, but we don't know real clearly if the rich kids, if it's the small classroom that's really helping them learn more, or if it's their non-school environment that's really helping them learn more. And what tends to happen is when these studies more carefully isolate the school effect from those advantages that the high-income advantaged kids have from home, these large effects of these things, they tend to decline. They tend to become much smaller advantages than we thought. Some of them still appear to be advantages, and they still, you know, schools may advantage kids in particular ways, but a lot of these are much smaller than we thought once we really carefully isolate the real school effect from this big non-school confound. But that's not the biggest problem. I think an even bigger problem is that, you know, we've tended, as social scientists, we've tended to go into schools and we've said, how are these schools increasing inequality? Let's look for the ways that they're exacerbating the problem. And when we go in with that perspective, we tend to find evidence for that. But we don't tend to think about what's going on in schools that might be compensatory and compare the magnitude of the two. It's sort of like, you know, trying to understand if a baseball team is doing well by just watching them play in the field on defense and never watching them at bat. And so you see them in the field and they get scored on and they get scored on and it doesn't look good, but you never watch them bat, and so you don't know if they're going to win the game or not. But we have not spent as much energy thinking about schools' compensatory processes or theorizing about them. If I talk to my students at Ohio State and ask them, how do schools exacerbate inequality? We can spend the next half hour throwing ideas up on the board and chatting through the different processes about how schools might make inequality worse. But then if I ask them, how do schools reduce inequality? We don't have much of a discussion. They're not prepared to talk about that very much. They haven't heard much about that. That seems really like a weird question. Schools, do they really compensate? I mean, well, I think it's a question we should think more seriously about and theorize more about, because the seasonal comparison evidence suggests that once the dust clears, schools actually are more compensatory than exacerbatory, that the compensatory patterns are stronger in magnitude than the exacerbatory ones. That doesn't mean that there aren't processes in schools that make inequality worse. There probably are. But it looks like once the dust clears, the compensatory ones are actually stronger. And yet we've spent most of our theoretical energy trying to identify the exacerbatory ones. And I don't think this does anyone any good. I think when we start to get distracted in this way and we don't really understand how schools operate, we don't really help disadvantaged kids in the way that we want to. So I think we need to theorize these compensatory processes better. What exactly are they? Once we do, we might learn that they're actually bigger in magnitude. At least that's what the seasonal comparison evidence suggests now. So here's another question that has led me to think that schools serving disadvantaged kids are doing better than we might think. We asked the question, what is the distribution of school-based learning? Really, which schools are doing the best in terms of promoting their kids' learning? And one way to answer this question is what I would call an achievement measure. And that is, you just compare test scores straight up across schools. And of course, if you do that, the schools serving high-income white kids have the best scores, and the schools serving low-income minority kids have poor scores. And it looks like the schools serving high-income white kids are definitely better. But we know that's just, an achievement score. It reflects partly what goes on in the schools, but it also reflects the non-school environments, the skills that they came in with at kindergarten, and all those advantages they continue to enjoy from home throughout all those years. So it's not really a very good measure of how schools matter. So one of the way a lot of states have tried to address this problem is to estimate what they call, growth models, where they'll look at, how much did your school's kids grow from 3rd to 4th grade, for example. And this way, you're not penalized or rewarded for where your kids start, but you're evaluated for how much you have taken your kids at zero growth and how much have you improved them. Now, I believe that this approach, this kind of these value-added measures are better approaches toward understanding how schools matter, but they're still not okay. They still don't get us a really good estimate of how schools matter for a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, you've got this summer going on, right, where the kids are diverging, and we shouldn't be holding the schools responsible for summer divergence. So, some scholars have recognized that, and they've started to move toward 9-month growth models, where you just look at, okay, how much did the kid grow during that 9 months? That's better because you've gotten rid of the summer confound. However, it's still not right. The only way that would be right is if these kids went home to the same home environments. They still spend the vast majority of their time outside of school at very different homes. Some of these homes, the kids go to the home and the parents are, really helping them with their homework and reinforcing school concepts. Other kids, they're going home to these really stressful homes that are detracting from learning. And so a 9-month growth model, if you're a teacher, you don't want to be teaching disadvantaged kids under that kind of evaluation system or a school, because it's going to underestimate the quality of what you're doing. So my colleagues and I thought about this problem and thought about how can we develop a measure of school quality that we think really does isolate the quality of what goes on inside the classroom. And so we developed a measure called impact, and I'm going to explain it to you conceptually. What we do to identify whether a school, basically how much school-based learning is going on, is we first observe what's the rate of learning among children when they're not in school during the summer. And then what we ask is how much faster do those kids learn once they're exposed to school. And we argue that the counterfactual is that these kids would have continued to learn at that non-school period rate. And so the difference between that counterfactual and our observed learning rate is a good estimate of the quality of the school and how the school is actually mattering for children's lives, what we would call school impact. So it turns out if you evaluate schools using these different measures, achievement, growth, and impact, you get very different answers about which schools are doing well. So we did that with the ECLSK data. We took 217 schools and we first evaluated them on the basis of achievement, just their test scores at the end of first grade. And each of these dots represents a school in the data set. And you can see that some of the schools have very high average reading scores up here on this scale in the mid-70s. And some of the schools have very poor average reading scores down here in the mid-40s. And I drew a line near the bottom, and I've identified the bottom quintile of schools, those in the bottom 20%, because these are the schools, they have the lowest average test scores, and they're vulnerable in most states to the failing label. So I'm just going to keep a red dot on those, and you can see how it changes as we move to different evaluation systems. So if we evaluate these schools versus, via growth, and this is how much does this school improve, how much do your kids improve between the end of kindergarten and the end of first grade, then things start to shake up a little bit. Some of the red dot schools that were failing before, they look a little better and they have moved above the sort of failing line. And some of the schools that look pretty good here have dropped down and they did not produce that much growth for their kids. But like I said, I think this is a move in the right direction, but it doesn't fully identify the school effect independently from the non-school environment. We think impact does that better, and once we evaluate the schools via impact, then things change even more, and now about 3 out of 4 of the schools that we thought were failing via the achievement measure are now looking pretty good. They're above that threshold line. And interestingly, 17% of the schools that we thought were good just on the basis of their raw test scores, now we think these schools aren't doing that well. We think, yeah, you have high test scores, but you're not promoting learning to the degree that you really should. Your kids perhaps are not being challenged to the extent that they really should. Yeah?
How do you think about regression to the mean here? Do you have some sort of way of thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, one question is it just easier to learn at the bottom of the scale, perhaps, than at the top? And one thing I can say is ECLSK really did a good job of trying to avoid those kinds of like ceiling effects that maybe you can't learn more if you're already near the top. What they did is they took a routing test. They took the kids and gave them first a short routing test. And if you scored really well on it, you got a form of the test that had a very high ceiling. So I think it worked because usually the classic sign of a ceiling effect is you've got a bunch of kids on the scale bunched up at the top with no room to grow. And there's not that pattern in the ECLSK data. The other thing that is interesting about that issue of is it just harder to gain at the top? There are a lot of schools in the data set that are high on achievement and high on impact. And it suggests to me there's no methodological reason why they can't be high on both. And I'd hate to succumb to the soft bigotry of low expectations and not expect more out of those schools that already have high test scores. So here's another empirical pattern that has affected my own views on this. This was done by one of my grad students, Joe Mary, and he was looking at international test scores and the typical pattern that the US, we kind of score we produce mediocre scores on these international tests. And Joe, here he's looking at 15-year-olds in the US, Australia, and Canada. And sure enough, they're beating us on both of these in terms of these PISA reading reading scores at age 15. And Joe notes that the gap between the US and Canada here is 0.3 standard deviation units. And that's pretty large at this age. At this age, that's almost a year's worth of learning. So, we're really far behind Canada in terms of reading at this point. But what Joe did that's unique in terms of these international studies is he followed this same cohort of kids backwards to ages 4 and 5 before they had started kindergarten. And he looked at their reading scores at that point, and he found that we were already way behind Canada and Australia at ages 4 and 5. In fact, we were behind 0.31 standard deviations behind Canada at that point. So we suspect that, whenever these international test scores are published, you hear the Secretary of Education come out and say, mea culpa, we need to improve our education system, we need to do better on these, and the president says the same thing, and everybody laments how terrible our schools are. These kinds of patterns suggest to us it might not be that our schools are poorer than Canada's. It might be that these gaps are there before schools have a chance to matter, and maybe we should consider differences in the broader non-school environment that might explain these. So, for example, Joe points out differences in infant mortality rates, low birth weights, poverty rates, and the Gini coefficient for inequality between the United States and Canada, and that these differences in these broader social indicators are a result of very different policy decisions that we have made. For example, we have chosen to spend less on social welfare expenditures, public health spending, and our unemployment benefits are less generous than Canada's. There's a great book by Dan Zuberi called Differences That Matter, where he compared these workers in Vancouver and Seattle who both worked for the same hotel company, but one group just happens to live in Canada in Vancouver and another just happens to live in the US in Seattle. And he documents how much better the Canadian workers' lives are. And he outlines a series of reasons: better union representation, access to universal health care, more generous social welfare policies, better public infrastructure. And it prompts us to ask questions about these broader social conditions and focusing on those issues rather than the school differences. So what should change about all of this? Well, I think, first of all, we need to rigorously assess the robustness of seasonal comparison patterns. Seasonal comparison research, there's just a handful of us doing this kind of work. It produces a very different understanding of how schools matter than more traditional work. We think it has really important implications and sometimes changes how we think about these things in pretty important ways. Yet not too many researchers are doing this kind of work. We hope more people will do this kind of work and analyze how do things change when school's in session versus not. We think it provides important leverage. So right now, there are a few of us who have studied. There are unfortunately just a few data sets that are collected like this, but we're hoping more people will dive in, look at seasonal comparison research, look at questions like, how the patterns change as children progress through school. Do they generalize to a wide range of cognitive skills? Do they generalize beyond cognitive skills to other outcomes? I also think that we need to develop a more theoretically balanced view of schools. That one error we've made is we've tended to go in looking for the bad stuff. And when you go in looking for the bad stuff, you're probably going to find it. But that doesn't mean that you will come away with an accurate understanding of how schools really matter for stratification. You are likely And we can continue to do that work. We can continue to go into schools, and you will find bad schools. But that doesn't mean that their overall role in the stratification system is bad, or that you're really identifying their overall role. So I think we need to, be open-minded about how schools might matter. They might make inequality worse in some circumstances. They might be neutral in some, and it appears there are some that I've shown you here where they are reducing inequality. And I think we need to elevate the role of early childhood and understand that that is playing a really important role in sending children down trajectories. And that then we are observing a lot of these inequalities during the school period, but just because we're observing them in the schools doesn't mean that schools are necessarily responsible for them. We also need to develop a less school-centric approach to social problems. We seem to, we ask a lot of schools, and we feel comfortable manipulating the school lever. And we feel less comfortable manipulating levers that might affect people's non-school environments. But those non-school environments are really where most of the action is in terms of inequality. And so by putting so much emphasis and feeling so comfortable fiddling with schools and using that particular lever, we may be missing the real leverage points where we can change inequality. So if we think about achievement gaps, my concern is that we have focused a lot on school-based solutions to things like achievement gaps with some attention to broader policy solutions. But what I would like to see, and I think would be more effective, is to increase our attention toward those broader policy solutions and see the linkage between broader policy conditions and the kinds of achievement gaps and inequality that children arrive with at kindergarten. So I'd like to see us put more attention in that direction. What would I do about schools? What would my policy recommendations for schools be? Well, I would like to see more schooling. Schooling looks good to me. When school's in session, kids learn faster than when it's not. And it's a compensatory force because they're not exposed to the non-school environment as much. So even though, inequality is not being reduced in the absolute sense, remember back to that treatment versus non-treatment graph. The real way to understand how schools matter is not to just look at what's happening when school's in session and saying, oh, they're gaining at the same rate. The way to understand how schools matter is to compare that period of the school period to the summer period and say, are schools making inequality better? Are they increasing it or decreasing it? So I would expand school exposure. I like 220 days a year rather than 180. I would, universal pre-care, preschool, all of those things, I would be happy for us to have more schooling than we have now. I would end current accountability schemes. I'm concerned that a lot of our accountability measures underestimate the quality of what's going on in schools serving disadvantaged kids. That they are fundamentally biased against what's going on there. And so it continues to feed into this notion that the schools serving disadvantaged kids are consistently poor. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't some really bad ones. If on my graph showing those red dots on achievement, growth, and impact, some of those red dots stay on the bottom all the way across, and those are bad schools. They're bad on achievement, they're bad on growth, and they're bad on impact. But I think we are too often diagnosing schools with low test scores or even low growth as poor schools when these teachers and administrators are doing a pretty good job with the students that they receive and the challenges that those students potentially have. If we're interested in market-based solutions to improving schools, then the implications, if I'm right, and my impact measure is the right measure of school-based learning, then we're sending parents in the wrong direction frequently. We think that we are improving schools by creating some markets and having parents vote with their feet and take their kids and go to the best school, but the parents, they don't have good information on which schools are really promoting the kids learning the best. In fact, those systems may actually be so inefficient, the information is so bad that it may be working against improving schools. And finally, I would identify and expand current school practices that are compensatory. I've been thinking about what these are. I have a few ideas, but I could really use some help. It's like, why haven't we been thinking about this? It's weird that we haven't thought much about schools' compensatory processes. It's sort of like if climatologists for the last 50 years had spent most of their time thinking about how the world is cooling. You know, that's what social scientists have done with regard to education. They've spent the last 50 years asking the wrong question. When the big picture suggests that schools are actually reducing inequality. And we need to think at least a little bit about how they're doing that. And yet we haven't thought about it hardly at all. But if you've been listening to this carefully, you'll realize, you know, I don't think we can address these issues very well via school-based reform. And so there are a lot of challenges facing a school-based approach. First of all, any school-based approach to things like achievement gaps is necessarily remedial. It's waiting till the problem is big and then saying, okay, we got a big gap here. Now what can we do with it via schools? And my view is, let's not let the gap get so big in the first place. That's what we really should be doing. It would probably be cheaper to prevent these large gaps from emerging in the first place than always taking these sort of school-based approaches and trying to address them later. Also, it's, you know, these school-based solutions, we do have cases of, you know, particular school treatments that have done amazing jobs with disadvantaged kids and raised their reading and math skills dramatically and potentially closed much of the gap between disadvantaged and advantaged kids, or maybe all of the gap. And some of these are impressive school treatments in localized areas. Those are difficult to take in our radically decentralized education system and expand beyond, you know, if you find this in Chicago, it's hard to even scale it up to Illinois, let alone the entire country, and deal with societal level inequality. So really, I think, you know, one of the big challenges of school-based reform is that it fails to address the source of the problem. We're kind of waiting till we see the problem. We see the problem in kids at school, but the source is much earlier. And finally, the most successful, these school-based approaches are most successful when school reform is provided to disadvantaged kids while denied to advantage. So you don't close gaps, you don't reduce inequality by taking a really awesome new school reform and applying it to both advantaged and disadvantaged kids. What you have to do is apply it to the disadvantaged kid and deny it to the advantaged kid. And the school treatment has to be way, way better than what the advantaged kids get. Like, you know, in the KIPP schools or the no excuses schools that have done pretty well, those kids, they're going to school about 1.5 times more than the typical kid. So you need a system where the school treatment for disadvantaged kids is so much better, and it would have to be obviously better than the schools that advantaged kids go to, that I think it would be difficult politically to make the case for that. So why has what I would call a distorted view of schools persisted? Why isn't everybody talking the same language that I'm talking? I don't know, you know. I've given this talk quite a bit. I'm writing a book this year at Stanford that maybe that'll get the word out more. But I would say, you know, scholars have known about these patterns for decades in terms of the seasonal comparison research, and they have not really changed the conversation that much. Part of it, I think there are some cognitive biases going on. One is the availability heuristic that we just have a lot more information available to us that schools serving disadvantaged kids are bad than that they're good. We hear a lot about this in the media. You hear, there's a lot of stories about, oh, you know, this low-income, largely minority school, you know, does really poorly on these test scores or has these discipline problems, these kinds of things. But you hardly ever hear the story of, you never hear the story of that school has really high impact on their kids' reading scores. It's just not something that journalists are aware of, that this school might be promoting these kids' learning in a really effective way. I also think, a lot of scholars, they look at the seasonal comparison patterns and they say, hey, the inequality is not declining when school's in session, therefore schools aren't compensatory. And it's a logical error. They're simply looking at the treatment period. They're not comparing the treatment to the non-treatment period. And I'm trying to change that. I think there's also a response to the Moynihan report from the 1960s where Moynihan focused on trying to understand some of the problems going on among African American families at the time, and he used some language. He talked about the pathologies in the Negro family, and he really focused on problems in the African American family, the rise of single parenthood and out of wedlock birth. And there was a pretty strong response to his report that he was blaming the victim. He was really focusing on blaming African American families for those problems and not really understanding the structural elements that were leading to those family conditions. And those critiques, I think, were on target in terms of he didn't fully articulate those structural conditions in the way that he should have. But an unfortunate aftermath of that is that we have avoided studying the family and the role that the family plays in all of this. The pendulum has swung too far. We are more willing to critique schools than families. Maybe it's a little safer to critique schools as an institution than families. But the unfortunate truth is that those inequalities emerge under the family's purview. And so if we really are interested in helping disadvantaged kids, we need to acknowledge that that's when the inequalities are really, that's where the action really is. Also, just a lack of methodological tools. I think we've used this sort of traditional approach to understanding schools for a long time that relies on trying to measure a bunch of school stuff and a bunch of non-school stuff and then isolate school effects that way, and it just doesn't, I don't think it works very well. So we haven't had the proper methodological tools. Seasonal comparisons aren't perfect, but they're a big step in a better direction. And I think if we move towards some of those better methodological tools, we'll get a more accurate understanding of schools. And finally, I think one thing I'm starting to think is just telling people these patterns and using numbers just doesn't seem to do the job persuading people. That if you come in with a view that schools serving disadvantaged kids are really horrible, just showing you these numbers may not do the job. That people change their minds more when they hear a story about little Jimmy sitting at his desk and the difficult non-school environment that he's enduring at home, and you kind of get people to identify with his kids. Sort of like in Waiting for Superman, they follow 5 kids, and you start to identify in that movie with the 5 kids, and then their overall message becomes more persuasive because you start to care about the kids. And the storytelling seems to work. Well, it turns out the people who've been using this seasonal comparison method, myself and a few others, that we just aren't the people who tell stories very well. We do the numbers thing, and maybe that's why we need to co-author with some storyteller people. So what I think really needs to happen is we need to think bigger when we're thinking about inequality. We need to think beyond schools, obviously. So one of the things that I would do if I were in charge is I would reform the distribution of rewards on a much larger basis. All of these kinds of things I would like to see that would affect the inequality outside of schools and I think would matter much more. Universal health care, family leave, increased minimum wage, EITC, more progressive tax system, improve the infrastructure, guaranteed housing. Of course, I would like all of that stuff. In addition, that's not all I want, though, because I also want this stuff. I want to reform the distribution of political power, too. Labor union laws, antitrust laws, gerrymandering, election rules, criminal justice system. Yeah. So I know, you start to smile. Sure, Doug. These are, yeah. But, you know, this is where the real problems are, though. I mean, so the good news is, I think schools serving disadvantaged kids aren't nearly as bad as we thought they were. The bad news is, if we're serious about reducing inequality, the problem is much bigger, perhaps, than we thought it was, and more, you know, more daunting in terms of trying to change it. Here's a really interesting study that I like that an economist, Russ Whitehurst, did, where he's looking at how big a deal, how much bang for your buck you basically get from these different programs trying to improve kids' reading skills. And so what he did is he compared programs on the left. These EITC programs are the Earned Income Tax Credit programs. And these are ones where, you know, working families that make really low wages get a big check at some point from the government because basically their wages are so low. And these studies look at how much that check improves these kids' reading scores. And the studies on the right are looking at more family reforms, I'm sorry, these are looking at more school reforms, class size reduction, preschool at, you know, young ages, and those kinds of things. And what you see is that, yes, for every, and what I really like about what Whitehurst did here is he took the programs and he said, for every $1,000 you spend on this program, how much do you increase these kids' reading skills? And if you look at the school-based programs on the right, they do work. For every $1,000 you spend, you get little bumps up in kids' skills, 0.01, 0.02 standard deviation units. But the bang for the buck is bigger via the Earned Income Tax Credit. When these families get more money, the bang for the buck is 3, maybe 4 times larger for those kinds of programs. So it makes me really think about how, yes, we can make a difference via some school-based reforms, but reducing the stress in these disadvantaged families just via a modest boost in income might get us farther along. So in conclusion, I would say this. Educational inequalities observed in schools are primarily a reflection of broader inequalities in society rather than a product of schools. Indeed, schools probably rub the rough edges off a bit. And while school reform has value, improving children's broader social conditions is likely a more comprehensive, perhaps more efficient way to improve opportunities for the disadvantaged. And finally, investing more in disadvantaged children's early childhood environments would make better use of human capital and promote equal opportunity. Thank you.